Live. Welcome to our hot topic for better or worse, ChatGPT, the universe, and everything. I'm going to tell you a little bit about USTPC and this webinar. So the important information about the webinar is it is being recorded and archived for public view online. And so now that we've got the recording squared away, the live captioning is enabled. See the control display on the bottom of your screen. And this event is on background for any journalists who are attending. Please contact us before directly quoting or attributing any comments that you hear today. Microphones of all of our attendees are muted, and you as participants are able to chat with panelists, but not with each other. But if you want to ask a question as opposed to a chat, please ask that question with Q&A because it's just too hard to manage both Q&A and chat at the same time. So again, ask the questions with Q&A. If your question is selected, the moderator, which is to say Jeanna Matthews, whom I'll introduce in just a moment, will pose your question to the panel, and you can ask either attributed or anonymous questions. If you have problems with the Zoom link or anything like that, please send a chat message to ACM Policy. Adam Eisgrau, our policy director, will be happy to help you. Let me tell you a little bit about the ACM US Technology Policy Committee. We are a part of the Association for Computing Machinery. This is how to get involved. It's very simple. It doesn't cost anything. If you're an ACM member, it's very simple to join. And once you read about what we do and you want to get involved, please email us at acmpo@acm.org, and we're happy to have you join the group. I'll talk to you briefly about what the USTPC is and what our policy is. Our mission is to inform the computing community and the general public about the impact of computing advances, education, and the application of technology in today's world. We're focused on policymakers and such, and it's very crucial that we're independent, nonpartisan, and technology neutral. We're not pushing an agenda because of our employment or other things like that. Our goal is to give the best scientific advice we can to policymakers. And to do this, we draw on the deep experience. There's over 50,000 ACM members in the United States. There's over 100,000 worldwide, and we draw on those folks as needed to supplement the expertise of our committee and provide the best scientific advice. We also work with our colleagues in other parts of the world on policy issues, although our group is specifically focused on US technology policy. And our goal is to leverage the base of the ACM membership to identify the best scientific research and practices to support public policy issues and develop that analysis and deliver it to policy leaders and decision makers. So it's a very exciting place to be. I hope you will consider joining us. And with that, let's move on to the actual meat of today's session. And I'm honored to turn the floor over to my colleague, Jeanna Matthews. Jeanna?
Thank you, Jeremy, and welcome, everyone. We're so glad you're with us today. In addition to the generative AI topic that we're going to talk about today, I'd love to point you to some of the recent work and past work that USTPC has done. I put a few links in the chat. The most recent is a statement on principles for responsible algorithmic systems that came out in October. There was another one of these hot topic webinars on that topic if you want to check it out. There's also a version in Spanish. And as Jeremy said, although this event is a product of the US Technology Policy Council, there is a Global Technology Policy Council and an EU Technology Policy Council, and this responsible algorithmic system statement was joint work from all of those folks. In the US TPC in particular, not surprisingly, we interact with US organizations and entities like NIST and NSF, and you can see comments that we've sent to entities like that. There's a statement on facial recognition technologies, and we kind of began this work back in 2017 with a statement on algorithmic transparency and accountability. Next slide. Can someone advance that slide, please? Oh, awesome. Thanks. So for our event today, we're going to be talking about generative AI. And I am so delighted to have our panelists with us today. We have a great panel for you. Not only some computer scientists, but also a professor of art. So we have a really nice, diverse set of voices for you today. In particular, Paul DeMarinis is a professor of art at Stanford University. He's a pioneer of computer use in performance art. Ravi Jain, who has been leading the development of a generative AI statement, which he'll tell you more about later, led AI for AR and the metaverse at Meta, and was VP at Amazon for Search AI and Alexa. And Alejandro Saucedo, who's the Director of Engineering and Applied Science at Zalando, who's also part of the ACM Council and the Europe Technology Policy Committee, are all with us today. And we, interestingly, are representing quite a wide range of time zones. I think we have Paul in Tokyo right now, almost midnight, and Ravi on the West Coast, still before 8 a.m., I believe. So welcome, everyone. And I'm a professor of computer science at Clarkson University, and I am part of the U.S. Technology Policy Committee and the global one, and have been for quite a few years. And I'm delighted to be moderating this panel. Okay, with that, I think we could take down the slides so that everyone can see and hear the panelists a little better. Could we take down the slides for a moment? Awesome. Thank you so much. We're having, today has been one of those days, I think maybe reflecting our wide time zones. we're getting it all together. So I want to just start out, we didn't really know all the backgrounds of folks who would be attending. And we thought we would start out with a little bit of background. So, what exactly is generative AI, and what does that have to do with the things we're seeing in the news lately, like ChatGPT and DALL-E? And I'm going to send that question to Ravi.
Thanks, Jeanna. Great to be here. And yeah, let's just talk a little bit about that. So generative AI is a broad term used to describe computing techniques and tools that can be used to generate new content. This includes text or speech or audio or images, and computer code and other types of artifacts. So, it is still AI. So let's talk a little bit about what AI is and how it works. It's basically when you go to, for instance, an e-commerce site like Amazon.com, and you type in a search query and you see results, there's an AI system that's providing you those results. So generative AI systems are also AI systems. And the way they work is they ingest data and train a model. And that model is described in terms of parameters. And then when that model is run and a user types in a query, for instance, on Amazon, then the model will produce a prediction. If you say, I'm searching for a gray hoodie, it'll show you what are the gray hoodies you're most likely to look at, to like. So we're very used to AI systems in our life. They're used all over the place on the web and in daily life as well. What generative AI differs is in a couple of respects. They are, of course, still AI systems. They ingest data, they have models, and they produce things. But what they produce is not just predictions. They produce actual artifacts that can be consumed by humans, like text or video or image. Okay. And in particular, what that means is they're not like other AI systems. They're not deterministic. When you search for gray hoodie, you might see a different set of gray hoodies every time you go to Amazon. In the same way, they're not deterministic. Also, the way they differ, though, from other AI systems is that aside from generating artifacts, they're very large. They typically use very large amounts of data, and the models themselves are huge. They can have hundreds of billions of parameters. That makes them very effective. When they generate text, it seems very complete. When they generate images, they seem very realistic, and they seem very high quality. You know, that's what leads to some of the excitement about these tools and also some of the concerns. So let me pause there.
Awesome. Thank you, Ravi. So it would be an understatement to say that there's been a huge public reaction to generative AI systems recently. And that reaction spans the entire range from enthusiastic excitement, this is the best thing ever for human productivity, to deep-rooted concerns. This is the worst thing ever. Deep concerns about accuracy and fairness. I'd really like to just start by unpacking that a bit. And I'd love to hear from each of our panelists. What do you see as the most exciting aspects of what's happening and the most concerning aspects? Alejandro, would you be up for taking that one first?
Yeah, great. So I think you've already highlighted a couple of the keywords that will certainly come up, you know, things like bias, security, privacy. However, before delving into some of those details, I am aware that, you know, we have a technical audience, and one of the things that I wanted to also provide an intuition on is the area that actually makes this technology is quite exciting and also potentially higher potential than initially, you know, assumed. And the way that I want to provide an intuition to this is to what is now seeming to be a trend that is going through basically the terminology that we can call an agent chain architecture for this type of foundation models. And why is it agent chain? It's primarily with the you know, kind of structure of how these models are being used for very high potential use cases, that they're being chained together to be able to perform certain actions. So instead of, let's take a practical example, instead of taking something like ChatGPT, which I assume most people here will have interacted with, that you can send a specific prompt asking it to not only answer a question, but you can ask a system like this to act as if they were interacting. We have seen some interesting things where they ask ChatGPT to act as an expert pilot or as an expert healthcare provider, but also act as things like a Linux terminal, right? And interact with ChatGPT as if it was a Linux terminal, sending a command, receiving a response, sending basically a request, receiving kind of a response. And one very creative approach that we have seen to extrapolate this is architectures where basically they take one of those foundation models and they allow people to be able to send a prompt like saying, hey, please give me the answer to this. Instead of allowing the model to just give a reply, they have an internal interaction with the model, a chain, which allows to use basically the full power of this model by saying, hey, for this model, you have to answer this question, but assume that you also have access to a search interface, and you're able to ask questions to the search interface by providing this response. So that basically allows the foundation model to be able to interact with a, in this case, agent. It could be something like search, like Google search or Bing search, so that it can actually be able to fetch things from external sources, right? So it's able to actually then interact with, in this case, it could be a search provider, or it can interact with an interface that can be a calculator, or it can interact with a database, right? So the reason why this is so interesting is because if we just take that example by face value of allowing something like ChatGPT or a foundation model to interact with a web search engine to be able to fetch a response, that is already providing an automation to something that you would normally do, right? You're trying to find something, you get your first top 5 results, you open them up, you read them, and you find the answer, and then you go back. However, given that now it is actually a model that is doing this, we are actually taking a completely different perspective into things that have already been, become part of society. Things like search engine optimization, right? How websites are able to optimize their sites to be found by web engines. That is going to change. How people are able to then put even advertisements within websites, that is going to change, right? Because now it's going to be a ChatGPT model interacting with that. And this is an example that provides an intuition from just search engine, but we are now seeing this chain agent architecture that is rolled out at different stages, right? Things like continuous development for programmers. Whenever they are building, writing code, they're able to now ask for things that are get created, like unit tests that get executed and iterated so that they're provided, right? So you can have like that TDD interaction. So before delving into some of the areas, I do want to provide kind of like an intuition of how these technologies are being used, that their full power is not just when you interact with them, but is when you embed them into workflows. And generative AI for images could be seen now and how it's revolutionizing even film creation. So it's about the workflows where they really have the big impact. So that would be one of my perspectives on that. So I'll just pause there as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Alejandro. Paul, how about you?
Well, as an artist, I'm of course fascinated with the, concrete results of typing in a prompt for an image, seeing what image it gives me. And, as a citizen, listening to all the chatter about, kind of the scarer phenomena, the dystopian, prognostications, I'm kind of prompted to ask, how unprecedented is this? The community seems to see this as unprecedented, and both in its threat and in its creative potential. Art's been operating with unprecedented things for about 30,000 years, art as we know it. Maybe the first big question was paint. Do you put it on the cave wall? Do you put it on your body? Do you put it on the cave wall with your body? All of these fundamental questions, every time something new comes along that has this expressive potential. I'm inclined to take a historical turn in looking at this. I'm interested in how unprecedented this is as a method of image making, image production, whether it's workflow or it's just the artist working with the idea of an image. I'm led back to the early 19th century. About the time 1830, 1840, two new image making technologies came about. One was lithography, the other was photography. Lithography made possible painting quality images that could be reproduced massively and disseminated. Think of like Currier and Ives prints on everybody's wall in Prairie America, maps, textbooks, all kinds of things. With continued perfection, lithography accounts today for 60 to 70% of all printing in the world. It was a fundamental shift in the dissemination of knowledge, visual knowledge. Photography was kind of a curiosity. It didn't really have a killer app for a very, very long time. Artists poo-pooed it, said it was vulgar and mechanical. It didn't have any possibility of mass deployment. So it was mainly used by middle-class people to have portraits, people who couldn't afford to hire an artist. It maintained this kind of status until the second half of the 20th century. It was not an official art form for a very long time. But it had this possibility, this indexicality that shook our understanding of what an image is. that everything that the lens saw came into the image. And these images could be legal evidence. They could be scientific evidence. This relation to truth was part of the question of what photography is about. So I'm wondering, is this generative AI, and I'm thinking here of image making primarily, is it lithography, which has a very strong and powerful beneficial effect on the world and economic benefits and so on? Or is it really unprecedented? Is it like photography? That's the way I'm trying to reason this out.
Thank you so much, Paul. I am really so delighted to have a variety of voices here, not just computing. Ravi, I would really like to hear from you on this as well. What are you most excited about and what are you most concerned about?
Yeah, no, actually, I love the way Paul framed it. I think this is both lithography and photography in the sense that generative AI, what's exciting about it is that it can enable things, it can enable vast numbers of people to do things that were only done by small numbers of people because of the degree of effort that was required or the degree of time that was required. So that's what's exciting about it, is that it can remove drudge work. It can do that. Even for an artist, the work that's kind of routine but goes as part of creating, a full image, it can do that. But it's also photography in the sense that the kinds of things that artists may be poo-pooing right now, but I think it does have the potential to open our creativity. The kinds of images that can be combined, the kinds of the artifacts that can be created, and that the speed of experimentation of ideas and putting them into a medium, I think it's much faster. And so I think in that sense, it can be both. So I think that's tremendously exciting. I think this will have economic benefits. It'll reduce monotonous work. It'll free us up for doing more creative, more stimulating and bigger things. On the other hand, I do think that we, like any such technology, we have to see what are the right limits of using it and what are the correct limits of use. Even with photography, it opened up a whole new medium and inspired so many artists to create great things. But we place limits on what you're allowed to photograph, and even if you're allowed to photograph it, we place limits on what you can do with that photograph. If you look at other technologies, with telecommunications or with aviation, they've brought us tremendous benefits, but we place limits on them. And a lot of times those limits have come after a long time after the technology has been widespread. And I think that leads to problems because sometimes the regulation and the legislation is running after the technology has already been deployed. It's very hard to put to be effective in that way. So I think with this new technology, just because of its vast potential for good, but also its vast potential for mischief, I think we should really be looking at our legal structures, our policy frameworks, our educational frameworks to see what are the right limits that should be placed on this technology so that we can enable the creativity, but minimize the harms. So that's how I think about it.
So yeah, it's interesting to me that I think in most of your answers, there was a focus on the excitement part, I think the promise part. And it's also interesting that we spent a fair amount of time thinking about the image generation portion of generative AI. Alejandro, your answers touched on some other types of use cases for code generation and other workflows. I'd love to follow up just a little bit. Would anyone like to speak to areas where you think it shouldn't be used right now, where the use cases that you see happening, where you think the consequences of the inaccuracies or potential bias are especially concerning? Or even if you don't see use cases right now, you can imagine them coming soon, and you'd like us to think about that. Alejandro, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think from my perspective, you know, this is something that we're going to probably touch upon later as well, but this is one of the things that I very much have liked, the European the European Union's approach, European Commission's approach towards sort of this question. And that has been really asking the question around risk and of course impact of the use case itself, beyond the technology, but of course with the technology also considering the risk that it brings, right? So and to be more precise, ultimately that boils down really to the context in which we are discussing, which is other situations where, you know, the impact of the outcome can have generational negative impact to an individual, to a group, right? And as well, whether the impact in itself can have risks for undesired outcomes, undesired biases. When that is the case, you know, of course, irrespective of the technology, whether it is a foundation model, whether it is even just standard NLP for document extraction, text processing, that may be using foundational models for some of the extraction of insights that then can be used in simpler ones. Ultimately, it does boil down to that risk assessment, right? And of course, there is a similar approach where even the regulation is putting specifically some use cases that just immediately fall under high risk, right? This could be things like biometric detection, particularly at the governmental level, as well as in the more sort of high profile cases where you hear about challenges of AI, things like automation of insurance, for example, or even in some of other use cases. So ultimately, of course, there can be a lot of examples, but I do want to highlight that this approach that is prioritizing at the risk level and the impact to the individual is the way to approach it. And taking into account that when using foundation models, you do have a lack of explainability and interpretability. You do have a larger risk of bias, with a significantly harder approach of being able to properly evaluate it, given the size of the models, the size of the data sets being used. So that has to be taken into considerations when bringing it into a particular use case. So yeah, that would be kind of like a holistic perspective to the question from my side. Mm-hmm.
I'm mindful of our bit of late start and wanting to also have time for open questions. But Ravi or Paul, do either of you want to weigh in on that question, or should we move on to the next one?
I think we can move on. Yeah.
Okay. So if we want to get the positive aspects of these systems without falling prey to the negatives that we're worried about, what are some of the best ways for us to do that? Ravi, I think you actually started in with some of that in your last answer. Would you like to expand on that a bit?
Yeah, I think there are a few areas that I think, so there's a very large number of risks that have been identified by the public, even by experts, for AI systems in general, but generative AI systems in particular. So these include the possibility of disinformation or deception, who owns the artifacts that are generated, who has accountability for, what is generated, transparency, do users have control over their own data, of their own likenesses, privacy, security, and then the accuracy or lack of accuracy of what's generated. So there's a very large number of concerns. And I think my main thing is, I think there are two things. One is, I think we should move quickly to address these concerns so that we're not chasing after the technology too long, but putting in the right frameworks. And I think the second thing is that we should involve all stakeholders in society to create those frameworks, right? To what are the appropriate limits of use? It can't just be tech companies or providers of models. It cannot just be the general public. It cannot just even be computer scientists. Really, this technology is important enough that we really need multiple stakeholders to come together and have an open conversation about what is acceptable and not. And I think that should lead to a review of our legal frameworks, of our regulations, perhaps agencies to enforce and interpret those regulations. I think that's really required. And because of the nature of this technology is global, eventually this should be done across national boundaries. That's my position on that.
Yeah, if we have time, maybe we'll return to some of the regulatory landscape and what's happening around the world. But another question I'd love to ask first is, all of the training data that has been assembled for this. Ravi, you talked about the massive, large language models, massive amounts of input this trained on. Do you think that people were really given a fair chance and informed consent for participating in the training of these systems? Do you think people realized that that their input was being used in this way? And is that concerning? What do you think?
Maybe I'll let somebody else answer since I've been holding forth on this.
Paul or Alejandro, would you like to give that one a try?
Yeah. So I don't know if Paul, or otherwise happy to take it.
Well, I think this kind of bears on another question I saw in the list there about creative process and what is, let's say, the commons, that culture that we share that establishes the meaning of images, the meanings of words, texts, of sounds. How do these marks and noises that we all make achieve meaning? And it is only within this very broad cultural context. There are some people who are more acutely aware and schooled in it, but everybody walks, talks, and breathes meaning, unlike ChatGPT, which gives words. So how these meanings come about and how they are shared is vital to the whole creative process, I believe. If we speak of creativity as being some specialized domain of the masterpiece or of artistic expression, I think we're going up the wrong tree. I think creativity is this sharing, this kind of inhaling and exhaling of images, words, thoughts, ideas, and it's something that everybody shares. And so what these images are that were put into this regurgitation machine, if I could be so blunt about it, is real. I don't think is too much of a point. Its massiveness is the point, and its corporate deployment is the point. So I think, like if I think that my images and sounds and words have been put into this, well, so what? All those things are out there.
Do you think we'll continue to have a framework by which everyone benefits from this collectively generated artifact? Or will we see a locking up, a privatizing, a lack of access to this tool? what do you think?
Me. I think I hate to be the one to say it, but it seems like so much of the abuse and imputed or worried about abuse really relates to its corporate qualities rather than its technological qualities per se. That a corporation can violate my copyright, and this happens frequently, but I cannot violate a corporation's copyright. There's this unfairness of image attribution, revenue streams, all of these things. It's an asymmetry that is built into our culture, whether we have AI or not.
So some of the regulatory landscape that we're thinking about or watching is about what Alejandro was saying, is kind of risk management or identifying especially serious consequences that could happen with high probability and regulating or watching those uses. Another could be about a public conversation about how the benefits of things we all contribute to return to society as a whole. Does anyone have any thoughts in that space? Some of the best ways you think we could be starting to talk about that now, to kind of Ravi's point of not only getting to it a long time down the road when so much of this has already happened and can't be taken back.
Maybe also, and I guess one of the things that I would say it's a very important discourse to approach earlier, to be able to be in a thriving position as a society in the medium to long term, is actually linked to the previous question of that you've asked around, people that data that was used to train these massive models, whether the individuals that produce that data, either directly or indirectly, had an understanding on that. One thing that I want to highlight is just the topic of privacy, because the challenge that we face with privacy itself is that similarly with organizations, when you have a data set, that data set and the risks involved within that data set are not static, right? Because what can happen is you may have a data set that may not have personally identifiable attributes. However, with advancement in technology and perhaps even the amalgamation of massive data sets, it is possible to infer enough signal from noise that some of these protected attributes, some of these violations of privacy can emerge as technology evolves and as new capabilities emerge, right? And I think the reason why this is an important thing to even approach consciously is because now we are seeing a lot of this can of worms opening, or more specifically, Pandora boxes being opened, because the data is already available, but we are now only learning that this data has the ability to expose significantly more than we expected, right? And in order for us to be able to be in a situation where we can be thriving with this evolving definition of privacy, is by making sure that we are ensuring that we are driving the conversation and the definitions, as well as the required restrictions, the required terminology for centuries-long topics like ownership, copyright, etc., to even the individually attributable, protected attributes, to make sure that we are understanding how the technology evolves, as well as how privacy is also evolving. So I would say that is in itself an important element that we do need to address, and it is actually a very active topic that is appearing, especially also in Europe, but also around the world. So I would say, privacy is one key topic. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Jeanna, maybe I could jump in here. I mean, I want to go back to a couple of things that were said earlier. I agreed with everything what Alejandro said, but I think Paul made a great point about the asymmetry, and I think that's baked into our society and our legal frameworks and everything. And I think that's at the root of a lot of concerns around ownership and attribution. But even if we had a perfectly symmetric situation, let's suppose that's the case, we're all in a village and we all have access to this technology. It's not clear to me that users know what parts of what they've produced has been used or what they've consented to. It's not clear that all users are giving truly informed consent for their artifacts to be used. Now, maybe as soon as it's produced, it belongs to the Creative Commons, but that's not how we've done things in practice. Also, users don't know necessarily how best to use these tools. So some of this may be malicious, disinformation campaigns by bad actors are a reality. But with other technology, when somebody creates a tool, whether it's a washing machine or it's a lawnmower or anything like that, the provider has to provide instructions on how best to use it, on what are its limits to use, and also provide enough information so that the tool can be evaluated, whether it's by an underwriter's laboratory or other experts or by citizens groups, to say, is it safe? Is it misleading? Does it do what it says it's supposed to do? Is it collecting too much information? Can it cause unforeseen harm? And so I think those considerations are not new. They've been around for a long time. And it's just that I think for AI in general, but generative AI in particular, the need for them is really heightened. And we should apply a lot of our learnings from other technologies to these areas. And I'm not sure that we're doing that right now. It's not clear to me that, in fact, there have been cases where users have gone to ChatGPT, for instance, and misunderstood or forgotten that this is actually an artificial agent that they're talking to. We need ways, and that goes back to the earliest examples of chat systems like Eliza, which were back in the day developed in academia, where users got confused that they were talking to a human being versus talking to an automated system. So those kinds of protections need to be put in place, because in reality, I think without that, the world is complex enough already, and the complexity introduced here can cause harm.
So even if we're not waiting for regulation to deal with this, we're thinking of educating the public, of saying what these tools can and can't do, what people can expect them to do, what is responsible use. It's interesting that if we focus on the image generation case, maybe I am able to fully assess whether I want to use an image that is shown to me, and there isn't really so much thing as an inaccurate image. And maybe if we're talking about code generation, I see Paul reacting to that, so there's probably it's such a thing as an inaccurate image, and I look forward to hearing him correct me as I wander into an area that's not mine. And maybe we're talking about code generation, and there's a way to test whether the code suggested to you functions the way you expect. But when people go to these systems looking for information, and what they're getting is plausible language generation, there is nothing in the training of these that says we're going to provide you an accurate answer. There's nothing about accuracy. There's only plausible language, and people don't understand, or as Ravi says, forget as they look at it, what would you say to, what are you saying to your friends and family about using these tools responsibly? What do you think we should be doing more as computer scientists and, you know, companies as presenting use cases responsibly to people?
Maybe I'll let Paul.
As far as I was amused by the idea of an accurate or inaccurate image, I think one of the things that makes the image generation tools at this point so interesting to artists is their kind of absurd inaccuracy, their goofy, pathetic images with too many faces or too many arms or missing body parts. Things that are absolutely, you know, beyond inaccuracy. What they suggest visually is kind of a wonderful, wacky world of almost like a Toontown of impossible arrangements of images. This is perfectly okay. I wonder if, however, if the tools were to become perfected and really achieve image accuracy to the degree that, let's say, the authority of ChatGPT is in the voice of its correct grammar, then would I still be interested in it? Is it just the uncanny valley effect that makes it so charming? And therefore interesting as a potential creative tool, something that suggests things that are not.
Yeah, actually, I'd love to jump in there, Jeanna, if I could. So I think Paul, what's wonderful when I look at these tools and I use them, like say in Midjourney, and I generate these amazing images, which are really expanding my my consciousness almost. I think the distinction is between knowing versus not knowing that this is human generated or that this is AI generated. So in that example where I'm looking at an AI generated image and it's wonderful, I enjoy it, and it may be stimulating, that's great. But if I look at an example where there is a news item which shows an event that supposedly occurred, but that image, which I tend to trust because it's an image published in a newspaper, let's say, that image has been AI generated. And if that's much less acceptable to me unless I know that it has been AI generated, and therefore I should look at it with a grain of salt. So, that distinction is really critical. So it's the same way when people are using ChatGPT with text. If they know that they're talking to an autonomous, to a artificial agent, and they're reminded of that, then I think that's very different, because then they can use it for saving themselves time, for becoming more creative, for reducing drudge work. But if they don't know, or if they forget, then I think that's where it becomes a problem. And I think sometimes with text-based systems like ChatGPT, the tone is so authoritative, the language seems so so confident that people can easily mistake it for fact. It sounds like you're reading from Wikipedia or Encyclopedia Britannica or a science magazine article because of the tone, not necessarily. And so then you may not necessarily check facts unless you're told that, no, in fact, you should check the facts, or somebody should check the facts.
We're used to viewing smoothness of text expression as a proxy for authoritarian, being authoritative or accurate. And it's very much not the case in this environment. Plausible language generation will give you something that's smooth, but not necessarily accurate. And it is interesting to think about use cases where the user is able to judge the utility of what they get back. Is this image useful to me? Is this code useful to me? Is this interaction useful to me? It's another thing when someone else is going to take that and pass it on as output to others, maybe not labeled in that way. So they don't have the ability to apply that same level of skepticism, whether that's a student doing their homework or whether it is, you know, a reporter generating an article. And I especially think about instances where the interests of those deciding whether something is good enough are very different than the people who will bear the consequences if it's not truly good enough. Maybe this would be a good time to bring in one of the questions from the Q&A, and also to encourage people to add to the Q&A if they'd like. Jim Hendler, who is the chair of the Global Technology Policy Council, says, some of the technical concerns being raised about generative AI is that they can categorically assert things that are untrue. Sometimes this is referred to as hallucinating. How much do we want to look at the autonomy versus the human in the loop nature of these systems in that light?
So maybe, and this actually is very similar to the second question. And it's actually, both of them are strangely related to Ravi's answer. I do want to build upon that and throw a bit of a curveball, because one of the things that I'm seeing, you know, and I opened the session with this agent chain architecture to just give an intuition. It goes back to this. I mean, I don't know if it's a saying or if it's just like a fancy, little story where they ask you a question of, hey, you have this car, and then you change the window. Is that the same car? Okay, what if we change every single other piece? Is that the same car, right? And when does it become a different car, right? And it is, something similar that we're facing here. That right now, yes, of course, we're interacting with things like ChatGPT or Midjourney, Stable Diffusion, directly with the model, right? Like we're giving a prompt, we're getting an image, right? And this is kind of like the extent of the interactions that we have. But I do see that the level of sophistication of the interactions that we're going to have with these models are going to become so embedded with so many layers of components that will involve both human, traditional software, and machine learning based, interactions, right? The example that I gave was, how you interact with ChatGPT so that it does a search, a web search for you and gives you the replies. Another example is the one for the code. It generates and tests it, and then you're able to interact with it. But we're also seeing other examples, right? I mean, right now, things that are becoming very popular are AI filters, right? Like people actually doing a live stream and then putting kind of a generative AI live stream, generative AI filter. That in itself is powered, by one of the layers of this large language model foundation models. And there are other examples where you may end up in a situation where perhaps you have things that are kind of in part generated by humans, right? Perhaps music. We're seeing some really, really, really impressive audio software tools where before you remember that you could put like little drum beats and then you make that your beat. Now you can actually have like, crazy human generated voices that have very, very advanced and rich pitches, as well as, music in itself. And people are combining this together with real humans and real instruments. So I think one of the challenges that we're going to be facing as well is to ask these questions of how do we make sure that, on one side, you're minimizing the hallucination by having kind of the human in the loop. And then the other side, how do you make sure that you are able to notify individuals that they are interacting with an AI? But it goes back to that point about when does a car become another car? When does something become, AI enough that it require that you can provide a nuanced and meaningful manner of educating the individuals that they're interacting with a subset part that it has been AI, that will become a real challenge. So yeah, I mean, this is just me thinking out loud, probably like went too deep in the rabbit hole, but just wanted to see if there are any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in on that actually. So I think one way, in fact, I thought, Alejandro, this is where you were going to go, but I mean, I think one way to think about it is in terms of levels of risk, right? And I came around to this idea kind of late myself, but you know, we see this all the time in things that in mechanical appliances. You know, there is a chance that my toaster is going to blow up. It's not very likely. It could burn the house down, but that's even less likely. And so I'm quite content to put in my toast and press the button and go away and do something else, right? The level of risk is low. On the other hand, when I get on a flight, if something goes wrong, things really bad could happen, right? So we have to define this in terms of what are those acceptable levels of risk. And risk is, one way to think about it is, what is the prevalence or the probability of something happening and how bad is the consequence? So if it's sort of the one way of thinking about it is the product of those two. If something, you know, if somebody dies as a result of something malfunctioning, even one instance is too bad, right? But if on the other hand, you know, a million people get the wrong suggestion for which gray hoodie to buy, well, you know, that's also bad. But, you know, if it happened to one person, that's less bad. If it happens to a million people, that's more bad. So that's one sort of utilitarian way of thinking about it. But there could be other frameworks for doing that. So the point is, you know, so you could take this product of severity and prevalence and say that's risk. But in some way, we need to come up with what are the levels of risk that we find acceptable? And for those levels, what is the appropriate response? Probably for everything, we need to have the user be informed. Probably for everything, we need to preserve privacy and security. But there's some cases where we need humans in the loop. I need to verify the hell out of you know, everything that's going on. And in other cases, we're perfectly fine to let it be fully autonomous because, you know, the risk is low. So that's one way to think about it, and maybe it's a way that we can try to balance the need for responsibility and safety while allowing the creative uses. So let me pause there.
Is the test then whether it becomes reality, whether this car that's made completely out of replacement parts is driving down the street one day, or is it whether the car hits you? I mean, if a song is generated by an AI and everybody's whistling it and humming it on the street, isn't that what it's supposed to do? Isn't that just culture operating? If, on the other hand, that song becomes the slogan of a political movement or something, then it's like the car hitting you or something. I don't know how we can prognosticate, how we can anticipate even what the nature of the test is. What the test would be.
Well, I think you're right. We cannot, in the sense that first of all, the technology is moving really fast, and it's you know, getting more sophisticated and beyond. I mean, I work in the area and I can barely keep up. But it's also not only that the technology, the base technology moves fast, but its applications are proliferating like crazy. So we don't know when will the car hitting the pedestrian happen or not. But we know that in some cases it's come really close. And in some cases, people will claim it has hit the pedestrian. But we also know that in the past, we have over 100 years of experience with introducing new technologies to the public, you know, whether it's done by corporations or whoever, you know, by academics or by individuals, or, you know, and we know that unintended consequences are just a fact that happens. And sometimes those are malicious and sometimes those are truly unintended. And I think, you know, we have some experience to base putting some frameworks around it even now. So that's my feeling.
Maybe just briefly as well to say that that's also why we're not seeing self-driving cars in the street, right? talking about the car and the risks, it is a hard problem with so many corner cases, right? That we just have to be able to manage, and assess that risk. And of course, those type of technology, transport technology vehicles are very much using large foundation models that are more specifically for image. But yeah, it's a lot of applications that are hard because of the AI safety, which is quite interesting.
Mm-hmm. That's definitely an interesting use case to consider, because the interests of those deciding whether it's good enough are not necessarily aligned with the interests of those who will bear the brunt if it's not good enough. And decisions made in an autonomous technology can affect whole classes of people completely differently, right? People in wheelchairs can be completely affected differently. Who's recognized as human, really fundamental questions. And to say it's just up to the corporation producing that car to say whether it's good enough seems not enough to me anyway. Instances where as Ravi was saying, the combination of the consequences and the probability of those consequences is high enough. What action should we be taking? And I think that answer is playing out differently around the world. Maybe this would be a good time to shift a little bit to that and say, Adam asked in the chat, do we think global standards are desirable or possible? There's certainly a lot of disagreement around the world about how we might approach this. What would we like to say about the global landscape? Alejandro, would you like to start maybe with some comments about what's happening in the EU?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so of course, in the global landscape, there is the regulatory side, and then there's also the private sector. So on the regulatory side, there have been some pretty interesting innovations within the European Union. So of course, the more higher profile was the AI Act, which we touched upon, is very much risk-based. And I think Ravi's definition of risk, provides an intuition of similar to that approach. But there has also been other less known but very interesting initiatives like the Data Act, which is basically trying to build a thriving data economy, basically trying to provide ways of interoperability to be able to use data that is non-person identifiable for means that can introduce value. And then others one that we have seen as well is things like the Digital Services Act as well. One thing that I do want to mention as well is not just the regulatory policy, but another element that we are seeing as core to this course is the more bottom-up approach. And we are seeing particularly the software practitioners and machine learning practitioners, even the individuals that are building the tools themselves, that are now becoming actually significantly more prominent in this discussion to ensure best practice and responsible use operation of these technologies. We are seeing this even through the concept of open source, right, and open models. Open source being, involving tools like, TensorFlow, PyTorch, scikit-learn that we are using as practitioners on a day-to-day basis. And the reason why I'm calling this out is because if we don't make sure that these tools are built with the capabilities to, bring these higher level principles in a way by design, it doesn't matter how many roundtables we have or how many, initiatives are rolled out. It does need to make sure that the infrastructure has to map to those high level principles so that we can have that auditability, that contestability, that reproducibility, security, etc. And I think there is also a lot that practitioners like ourselves are doing to explore how these emerging technologies can be used responsibly. So as much as there is that, interesting areas from the top bottom on the regulatory side, there's also really interesting areas at the bottom up at the global. So yeah, I just wanted to share some initial thoughts on that.
I'm not trying to do too much talking as the moderator, but when we were talking about this topic, folks said I should weigh in a little on what's happening in the US. One thing I put in the chat was a pointer to NIST's AI risk management framework, which is a voluntary framework. So it's not requiring this risk management process. It emphasizes management of risk throughout the life cycle, and mapping risks, measuring them, managing them, governing the risk management throughout the life cycle. There's also the OSTP's AI Bill of Rights is a notable thing in the US. Certainly, there's been a lot in the news lately. You might have seen the, Italy banning ChatGPT and then unbanning it, which if nothing else points to a good example of the level of confusion that's going on. There was a draft Chinese statement worth looking at. Ravi or Paul, would you like to say anything about things you see happening in the kind of global regulatory climate?
Well, I could jump in. I think lots of governments are getting concerned about this technology, either because they fear that they may lose control over it, or they fear its consequences. Or they want to have control over it so that they can, get benefits. I think what I see is a few things that are concerning to me. One is that, while I welcome the concerns, I think sometimes they're not always founded on technical realities. So there's a generalized concern that's derived from science fiction, perhaps, of, killer robots taking over humanity and that kind of thing. And that's sort of feeding a narrative which I think is not realistic and is not, well-founded on the technology as it exists today. And I think it's easy for people who don't understand this fully, or people who are, perhaps in the media, to run with that narrative. And I think that just leads to needless heat without much light. On the other hand, I think that, I'm not sure we as a community have done enough to educate the public. Maybe we could do more based on what the technical realities actually are. But more generally, I think there actually aren't enough stakeholders participating in this discussion in a comprehensive way. People are reactive to individual things. So, an artist releases a new song, and so then the music community gets concerned about that, or other artists who are painters, or perhaps in Hollywood, people who are writing scripts, and and on and on. But these are sort of point-wise responses. So I think we need all stakeholders to be more engaged and more informed, and so that can only happen through a convening of the stakeholders. And that needs to, only certain entities can really do that, so that we can have that convening and then have that discussion openly. I think that's what's leading partly to the confusion we're seeing, where, Italy banned ChatGPT, then unbanned it. If you look at the Chinese regulations, they're different. They have some commonalities with what's in the NIST framework, but some things that are very different. If you look at, there have been efforts in Congress to solicit input. So I think we need, I don't know if a single global standard is possible, but a more engaged and informed conversation that crosses national boundaries is important. Maybe there is something like an AI Bill of Human Rights or whatever, something like the UN, Bill of Human Rights. But I think we're very far from that. But even if you don't get there, I think there needs to be that conversation that's informed and engaged, and in fact, a responsible conversation. I think that's not happening. And that does need to go beyond national boundaries. Because anytime it doesn't, then you find seams that can be exploited or can lead to confusion.
I'd like to point out a piece in the responsible algorithmic systems work that came out in October on there's point 8 is accountability and responsibility. So maybe I can even paste this into the chat for everyone. But that statement said that public and private bodies should be held accountable for decisions made by algorithms they use, even if it's not feasible to explain in detail how those algorithms produce their results. Such bodies should be responsible for entire systems as deployed in their specific contexts. You know, when we talk about I won't read the whole thing, but when you talk about large workflow chains and an ultimate impact on individuals and societies, you know, do you think we have the collective will to hold the end of that chain responsible? And really, is there any other option?
I can give it an initial go, and I know that I can see Ravi's thinking as well. I don't know if you want to jump in, otherwise I'm happy to share some initial thoughts. Yeah.
Alejandro, jump in. Alejandro or Paul. I think Paul raised this question about asymmetry, which is in some way reflecting what you were saying, Jeanna.
Okay, yeah. So first, yeah, please go on, Paul. I can see that you're going to jump in.
Oh, well, I think when it comes to something like the author's rights and the concept of what an author's rights and responsibilities are, it's a lot clearer than it is when, you know, such as Ravi suggests, the unintended consequences of someone believing something stated by ChatGPT. You know, in this kind of accountability it isn't just the outcomes, it's rather the possibility of responsibly tracing sources versus the perhaps impossibility of tracing consequences. In other words, it's easy to define an author, and an author in certain societies has certain rights. In the United States, our copyright law gives me monetary rights. In Europe, the Berne Convention would give an author moral rights as well. That is, what can be done with their work, whether somebody's rock song can be used in a political rally that the author disagrees with. I thought these different cases and responses were from different areas are really telling. The Chinese statements seem to have a great deal of concern about responsibility to the overall, to society as a whole, while not having that same emphasis, let's say, on authors' rights. So I think it's a real mix, but in general, it's easier to trace, to make accountability, to trace down from an author's work to an artifact that's spat out by an AI than it is to trace the human consequences of something that is spat out by an AI into what happens in society, the collisions. These are two different levels of ethos. They both have to do with ethics, but they operate at different levels, I think.
No, actually, I was going to jump in. I agree with you, Paul. I think there's another aspect that we haven't touched on as well, which is either through malicious actors or through errors, or through bad design or the limits of the technology, errors are going to happen, right? And we've talked about how severe those errors can be. And those, they can have consequences. But is there a notion of correctability? So for instance, somebody I think in the Q&A mentioned it would be great if ChatGPT said that they'd received the Turing Award, but in fact they haven't received the Turing Award. So is there a way that the output can be correctable? And should it be correctable? And who would bear the responsibility for that? And I think that's a way of putting guardrails around some of the consequences. And I think it's something for us to think about, what types of technology can be developed to allow correction of errors, and what kind of technology can be developed to make that correction transparent, or process or framework can be developed to do that. I think that's something that has been taught, because I think even with the attribution, suppose you have the attribution to a particular AI, that's good, then you know who's responsible, but can it be corrected? Should it be correctable is another important point.
Mm-hmm.
I think one thing I'm definitely going to take away from this conversation is how we've been returning to the asymmetry of things. If you have entities that want all the value of something, but don't want any of the liability or obligation to correct, or, that's just a recipe for a huge problem. What we need to do collectively, regulatory wise, in the technology side and in the computer science side, in the education of users side, to address that's a huge open question. But I think much of the problem may not really be from the technology itself, but its deployment in a very asymmetric power structure.
Mm-hmm.
So many good questions in the chat that I'm not sure we're going to get to all of, and I'm sorry about that. Maybe we can.
Maybe on that topic, because I think this is probably like one of the key ones that like from my perspective opens even like that meta question that you've said is how do we provide the guardrails to ensure that the deployment of these technologies can be done in a safe manner? And one of the things that I've started to see as a trend is similar to how we have seen in the general software development world, the concept of an organizational software development lifecycle, like an SDLC that gets rolled out as the best practices, where you have to make sure that you run tests, then the deployment actually gets done by operations, you have observability and monitoring that is necessary at scale. Organizations have attempted to roll out what is analogous to a MLDLC, right? Like a machine learning development lifecycle, in a similar way to an SDLC, but it has failed because with machine learning, it's not as rigid and deterministic, and it's very use case specific. So not always you're going to have the same level of unit testing, the same level of, as Ravi said, contestability measurements, the same level of auditability structures. And that actually requires a bit of kind of like that, I don't know if you call it flexibility or moldability, that is proportionate to the risk, and introduces, I think what was also highlighted, the accountability touch points, or more specifically, the human touch points, so that you have an explicit understanding of that sort of, I guess, two-side component that Paul mentioned, the lower end of where does accountability lie throughout the development and operation of the machine learning systems themselves, and at which stages do you need those things like correctability, contestability, et cetera, et cetera. So I think organizations are also grappling with how do we roll this out, not just for a use case, but at scale. And this is definitely going to be an interesting just area of development of this asymmetry, I think, as you put it, which is interesting.
So as I watch the clock here, I'm told that we could go as much as 12:10 Eastern time, so 15 more minutes. But I would like to kick one question to Ravi about the statement that he's leading the work on. And then I'd love to return to all three of you for kind of last words. So if you want to take a look at the Q&A, see if there's a question you especially want to bring up and answer, or reflect on if there's something you haven't gotten to say, think on that for a minute. Ravi, you won't get to think long because I'm going to ask you something else. You've been leading a group to develop a statement of principles for generative AI, somewhat based on the responsible algorithm systems work. Can you give us a little preview of when we might see that, how it is different than the responsible algorithmic systems, how people might look for that? Anything else you want to say about that work?
Yeah, thanks, Jeanna. I'm actually acting as coordinator. This is a team effort. So we have tried to get input from a wide variety of folks to come up with a statement about principles for generative AI. What we're doing is we're building on top of the statement on responsible algorithmic systems that ACM released back in October. A lot of those principles apply, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. But generative AI brings up new issues like we've been discussing in this forum. And we have a draft that's ready and that's being circulated for discussion. And I'm hopeful that we can get something for wider discussion in another few weeks. Just to clarify a few things. First of all, anybody who's participating in that, including myself, is speaking for themselves as ACM members, not as representing any employers or other partners. And secondly, ACM does not take a partisan position. For instance, in the US, our goal is to provide technology-based information that can then be used by legislators and regulators and bring sort of a technical element to the public discussion. With that said, we welcome input from everybody on that draft. And if you'd like to participate, just join the USTPC or the EU Technology Policy Committee. I think there was an email that was circulated at the beginning of this session, or if somebody can put it into the chat, and feel free to engage, and we'd welcome comments. And hopefully that we can get that statement out in a few weeks.
Wonderful. Thanks for that, Ravi. So let's do a round of last words, last questions you want to answer, points you want to make. Paul, can I start with you?
Yeah. I guess I would like to insert a phrase from the art historian and architect Siegfried Gideon. A phrase he used, the ruling taste, that for stakeholders, particularly for powerful ones, such as corporations or governments, the profits, the power, the bottom line are only the means. And the goal then is to create and manage this ruling taste, which is the style that everyone thinks they want. This is how the hegemony is established, I'd suggest, through taste.
Thank you for that. Alejandro?
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is something that I tend to also emphasize a lot, and I do want to close with these words, and that is that I know that there's a lot of practitioners, computing practitioners and academics, perhaps in the audience, and I want to emphasize that ultimately, ethical challenges of this extent, risks of such magnitude should not fall on the shoulders of a single practitioner. These are things that have to be approached through the human accountability structures. As ultimately we have to remember that an individual can be responsible, an individual can be ethical, but that doesn't mean that the compound is as well, and that the output is as well. So that's also one of the reasons why it's so important for initiatives like the one that Ravi is currently spearheading, as well as others that are trying to really understand what are the best practices to drive and the conversations to support to understand how to best use these emerging technologies. So I do encourage practitioners to get involved, to contribute, as this voice is very important. Yeah.
On that note, I'll mention that I think one of the powerful uses of the responsible algorithmic systems statement or the 2017 statement have been, working engineers using it to advocate within their companies as, best practices, as professional ethics. These are things that we need to be paying attention to, feeling like that is a support for them when they want to be a voice in internal conversations. Also, those statements are useful to policymakers to kind of educate them from a computing perspective on these computing technologies, what they can and can't do, what the risks are. So if those are inspiring uses to you, those are reasons to join and get involved in crafting things like that, and also an invitation to use them when you talk to your representatives or when you're advocating in your workplace. Ravi?
Yeah, I'll end with a sort of a meta comment. I think what's exciting about AI and generative AI in particular is it's sort of where computer science meets the rest of the world in a very real way. And I find that, really exciting, both in terms of the capabilities now. I could never have thought of composing a song, but now maybe I can. But also, more importantly, I think in this process, which we've been engaged in, I found this process of thinking about how to limit the use or what are the right limits of use of the technology, this discussion around policy has been very stimulating for me personally. So for instance, the conversations that we've had, like especially say an input from Paul from a different discipline, has really changed my thinking about how we should think about regulating this technology. Some of the conversations with Alejandro around how people in, policymakers in Europe are thinking about this have really changed my own thinking about risk levels and so on. So I think there's the excitement about the technology and its concerns, but there's also excitement about this process. And I'm glad that this technology is having this cross-discipline, is forcing this cross-disciplinary conversation and cross-national conversation. And I hope that will become something that will stay with us. There will be new technologies in the future that'll be even more powerful, maybe even more problematic. But I think the meta value from this is keeping this nature of this conversation alive and having it produce useful outcomes. I think that's what's really interesting. So, and I think it'll be good. We'll serve our profession well in the long term.
Terrific. Well, we are now past 1 a.m. in Japan, where Paul is. And we've run over just a little, but we also started a little late. I think I'd like to thank you all for participating in this. Thank you for all the good questions, even if we didn't get to answer them all. Please stay in conversation and pass along the recording to those who you think might benefit from it. I will pass it back. Adam or Jeremy, are you going to wrap up with a last thing? I think you're just showing a slide maybe of reminding how to get in touch with us.
Thanks, Jeanna, and thanks to the panel for a great program. Jeremy, please take it away. There's a slide for you.
Thanks very much, Adam. Thanks, Jeanna, and all the panelists. Really appreciate the excellent conversation. Just a reminder that this has been recorded. It will be posted on our website soon. And if you're interested in joining us in USTPC, please send us an email if you want to find out more about some of the position papers and other things we've done recently. They're all posted on our website, and look forward to having you participate in USTPC in future hot topics. And one more time, thank you to our excellent panel for a great discussion today. Have a good day, everybody.